81 soldiers marched out of a fort on a freezing December morning in 1866. Not one came back alive. They had been lured beyond a ridge by warriors who pretended to limp and feigned wounded horses and stumbled just close enough to make armed men furious. On the far side of that ridge, 1,000 fighters waited in frozen ravines, so still that the landscape itself appeared empty. The temperature was below zero. Breath hung in the air like smoke from fires that were not burning. Boots broke through a crust of snow with each step, the sound carrying across a silence that was not the silence of empty country. It was the silence of 1,000 men breathing through their teeth. Some had been in position since before dawn, hours in sub-zero cold without moving, without speaking, without making a single sound that might warn the column walking toward them. This was not a spontaneous attack. It was a trap designed over weeks, rehearsed, refined after a failed attempt 15 days earlier, and executed with a discipline that the fort it was aimed at could not have matched. The man leading the soldiers had boasted that 80 men could ride through the entire Sioux nation. He got his 80. The lesson lasted 40 minutes. The silence afterward lasted a century. In 1866, the United States decided to build a road through the heart of someone else's country. The Bozeman Trail was a shortcut to the Montana goldfields, a dusty artery carved northward through the Powder River country, some of the richest hunting grounds on the North American continent. Buffalo herds darkened the plains here in numbers that no European had ever seen. The rivers ran with snowmelt and fish. The valleys sustained the Lakota, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho the way the Mississippi sustained St. Louis. This was not wilderness. This was home. The government did not ask permission to build the road. It did not negotiate access. It built forts to protect the road, while simultaneously conducting treaty negotiations in which it promised the Lakota that their land would remain their land. The contradiction was deliberate. Negotiate with one hand, build with the other. Fort Phil Kearny rose from the Wyoming plains in the summer of 1866, a rough stockade on an exposed plateau garrisoned by soldiers who were supposed to keep the trail open at any cost. The fort was a splinter in the flesh of the Powder River country, and the body it was embedded in was already rejecting it. Red Cloud, the Oglala Lakota leader whose name would define the entire conflict, understood something most American commanders did not. You do not beat the United States Army by meeting it head-on. The Army replaces everything it loses. You beat it by making the cost of staying higher than the cost of leaving. For months, Red Cloud waged exactly this war. His warriors struck wood-cutting details and vanished, raided supply trains, harassed patrols until the garrison's morale crumbled like a wall where water has found the cracks. Not a single dramatic collapse. A slow, steady dissolution that left the fort standing, but the men inside it hollow with exhaustion and fear. The fort was surrounded by an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, and that enemy was about to concentrate into something the Army had never faced on the plains. A coordinated military operation involving over 1,000 fighters from 3 nations executing a plan that had been rehearsed, refined, and perfected for exactly this moment. Captain William Fetterman arrived at Fort Phil Kearny with the confidence of a man who had survived some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War by doing one thing: attacking. He had fought at Murfreesboro and Atlanta and survived the bloodiest battles of the Civil War by doing one thing: attacking. He looked at the garrison's caution and saw cowardice. He reportedly boasted that 80 men were all he needed to ride through the entire Sioux nation. The number 80 would follow him into history the way a shadow follows a man into a room he will never leave. But here is the thing about applying Civil War instincts to a plains war. Every instinct that had kept Fetterman alive at Murfreesboro was about to get him killed at Fort Phil Kearny. In the Civil War, the enemy stood in formation. You could see them, you could count them, You could estimate their strength and choose whether to charge. On the plains, the enemy was invisible. The landscape that looked empty could contain hundreds of warriors in its folds and ravines. The charge that would have broken a Confederate line would carry a cavalry column directly into a kill zone designed by men who had spent months studying exactly how American soldiers respond to provocation. The Lakota Coalition had learned Fetterman before Fetterman ever met them. They had watched every patrol, every relief column, every angry pursuit that overextended beyond the fort's walls. They knew that American officers chased. They knew that American pride was a weapon that could be aimed. And they had spent weeks designing a trap built specifically to exploit that pride. The geography of the ambush was itself a weapon, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything that followed. North of the fort, a spine of high ground called Lodge Trail Ridge ran roughly north to south, like a wall drawn across the landscape. On the fort side of that ridge, soldiers were visible from the stockade. Relief could be sent. There was at least the illusion of safety. On the far side, the ground dropped into a maze of gullies and ravines and frozen draws. Terrain deep enough to hide an army and broken enough to deny cavalry its only advantage, speed and mobility. Lodge Trail Ridge was a line drawn in the frozen earth. On one side, the fort. On the other, a killing ground. Colonel Henry Carrington, the fort commander, understood this with the clarity of a man who had learned caution through months of being outsmarted. He gave Fetterman an explicit order: pursue the attackers to relieve the wood train, but under no circumstances cross Lodge Trail Ridge. No circumstances. The fort regularly sent wood-cutting parties to the nearby pine forests because the garrison needed timber constantly. Construction, fuel, survival. And Red Cloud's warriors regularly attacked these parties because the response was predictable. Wood train goes out, warriors attack, fort sends relief, relief chases warriors. The pattern had repeated itself for weeks like a clock that the coalition was about to weaponize. On December 6th, 15 days before Fetterman marched out, the coalition had sprung this same trap. Decoys rode out, soldiers chased. But the soldiers stopped at the ridge, looked at the open ground beyond, and turned back. Something had felt wrong. The 1,000 warriors in the ravines watched the column withdraw and held their discipline. They did not charge. They did not break cover. They let the soldiers walk away because the plan demanded patience. And patience was the one weapon the coalition possessed, in greater supply than any army on earth. In the days that followed, the trap was rebuilt, not from scratch, from the failure. The decoys had retreated too quickly. The performance had lacked the physical detail that turns a man's caution into pursuit. The refinement was specific: slower retreat, a horse that limps, a warrior who stumbles. Details so convincing that the man watching through his rifle sights sees weakness instead of theater. On December 21, they were ready. And on December 21, they were ready to try again, with a refinement that turned a failed experiment into a masterpiece. Before dawn on December 21, over 1,000 warriors moved into the ravines beyond Lodge Trail Ridge, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho. An extraordinary coalition assembled in the dead of winter. The logistics alone were staggering. Feeding and sheltering 1,000 fighters in sub-zero temperatures required coordination that the army, shivering inside its stockade walls, could not have imagined from the people it called savages. Then the decoys rode out. A hand-picked group of approximately 10 warriors drawn from every nation in the coalition: Oglala, Miniconjou, Cheyenne, Arapaho, every tribe represented because every tribe had earned the right to be part of the performance. And it was a performance. These men were not fighters in the conventional sense. They were actors. Their job was to ride within rifle range of 81 armed soldiers and make those soldiers angry enough to chase them beyond the ridge. The oral histories of the Lakota, maintained and transmitted by people who were present or received accounts directly from those who were, place Crazy Horse among the decoys. He was perhaps 25 years old. Not yet the legendary figure history remembers, a young warrior with a growing reputation for the specific kind of courage this mission required. Not the courage of the charge, the courage of the lure. The decoys appeared near the wood train first, harassing the detail with hit-and-run tactics the fort had seen dozens of times. Then, as Fetterman's column approached, they shifted. They stopped attacking the wood train. They turned their attention to the relief column, and they began to fall back. Not fleeing, not running, retreating, with a precision calibrated to trigger exactly one response: pursuit. One warrior's horse appeared to go lame. He dismounted on the open ground between the column and the ridge, struggling with the animal, adjusting a cinch, checking a hoof, performing the universal gestures of a rider with a broken mount, just close enough that a man with a Springfield could almost reach him, just far enough that the shot would require closing 50 more yards. And every time the column closed those 50 yards, the warrior would swing back onto his horse and limp another 100 yards north. Another decoy stumbled, as if hit by a ricochet. He went to one knee, touched his thigh, rose slowly, presented a target so irresistible that men with loaded weapons physically leaned forward in their saddles. The soldiers could taste the kill. It was right there, close enough to touch, close enough to end. And that nearness, that maddening, almost there quality of a target that stays just beyond reach, is the most powerful weapon in the history of ambush warfare. Because a man chasing something close enough to taste does not look at the ground around him. He does not scan the ridgelines. He does not wonder why the landscape ahead looks different from the landscape behind. He looks only at the target, and the target keeps moving north, toward the ridge. Every few hundred yards, the decoys pulled the column closer to Lodge Trail Ridge. The cavalry rode ahead, pulled by the nearness. The infantry struggled to keep pace on foot, boots crunching through frozen snow, the column stretching and separating as the gap between mounted and foot soldiers widened. Discipline fraying in the excitement of a chase that felt like it was about to end any second. If Crazy Horse was among those riders, and the oral histories maintained by his people across generations say he was, then he was 25 years old and already practicing the art that would make him the most dangerous man on the northern plains. Not the art of the charge, the art of the wait, the ability to hold still while armed men aim at you and trust that stillness will do what speed cannot. Every time the soldiers surged forward, the decoys gave ground. Every few hundred yards they pulled the column closer to the ridge. The morning before the decoys rode out, something had happened in the coalition's camp. A Winkta, a two-spirit person, believed to hold prophetic power, had performed a ceremony. The prophecy was specific. The trap would yield 100 in the hands, roughly 100 enemies killed. The warriors rode out with that number in their ears. Fetterman had 81 men. Fetterman took the bait. Instead of relieving the wood train and turning back as Carrington had ordered, he wheeled his column north, directly toward the retreating decoys, directly toward Lodge Trail Ridge. The wood train was forgotten. The mission was abandoned. The cavalry rode ahead, pulled by the maddening nearness of targets that stayed just barely out of reach. The infantry struggled behind on foot, boots crunching through frozen snow, the column stretching and separating. The decoys crested the ridge and vanished. Fetterman followed. His cavalry crested. His infantry labored up behind them. Every man crossed the line Carrington had drawn. And on the far side, in the ravines and gullies, silent and motionless and patient beyond anything these soldiers could comprehend, 1,000 warriors watched them come. The signal went up, and the frozen earth itself seemed to explode with human life. From every fold in the terrain, every ravine, every draw, Every shallow depression that had looked like empty ground seconds earlier, warriors rose. Not one or two, hundreds. Simultaneously, the ground that had been silent and white and motionless was suddenly filled with men running and screaming and firing arrows with a speed that turned the winter air dark. The effect on the soldiers was instantaneous and devastating. One moment, they were chasing a handful of wounded stragglers across open ground, certain that another 50 yards would bring the kill they had been chasing for half a mile. The next moment, the empty landscape was full of men, full of arrows, full of sounds that no training manual at any fort in America had prepared them to hear. The 10 decoys who had drawn the column here wheeled their horses and joined the attack. The bait had done its job. The trap had held. The cavalry, which had galloped ahead of the infantry chasing the decoys, was hit first and hit hardest. Separated from the foot soldiers by several hundred yards, a gap that would never close. Lieutenant Grumman's 27 mounted men were surrounded on the lower slope before they understood what was happening. They dismounted and tried to form a defensive position, but the terrain that had hidden the warriors for hours now denied the soldiers a single rock to crouch behind. Warriors closed from 3 directions. The mathematics of reloading became the mathematics of death. A skilled warrior could loose 10 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a single-shot Springfield once. In those 5 seconds of fumbling with frozen fingers, extracting a spent cartridge, inserting a fresh round, ramming it home, 3 arrows found flesh. Lieutenant Grumman's cavalry, roughly 27 men, was surrounded on the lower slope. They dismounted, tried to form a defensive position. The terrain that had hidden the warriors now denied cover to the soldiers. They were overrun within 20 minutes. Among the warriors in the thick of the killing was High Backbone, called Hump, a Miniconjou war leader. Not a strategist operating from a distance, a fighter at arm's length. His presence is a reminder that this victory was built by many kinds of courage. The planners who designed the trap, the decoys who offered their bodies as bait, and the men who closed the distance and fought hand to hand in the freezing cold. On the slope above, 2 civilians made a stand that both sides would remember for different reasons. James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher carried Henry repeating rifles, 16 rounds without reloading. In a battle dominated by single-shot weapons fired by frozen hands, they were an anomaly so devastating that warriors who had been charging without hesitation suddenly stopped and took cover. The Henrys cracked in rapid succession, a sound completely different from the measured spacing of Springfield fire, continuous, relentless. Wheatley and Fisher cut down warrior after warrior at a rate that no single-shot weapon could approach. The ground around their position became a ring of spent brass casings, bright against the frozen earth. Warrior dead accumulated in a circle around 2 men who were fighting with everything the 19th century could give them. But 2 men cannot hold every angle. The warriors adapted with the speed of men who had been reading combat since they could ride. They stayed low, used every fold in the terrain to approach from angles the rifles could not cover, sent arrows arcing high from positions behind the 2 men, trajectories that no rifle could track because they came from above and behind. Wheatley and Fisher died where they stood. When their position was reached, warriors counted the brass casings, dozens of them scattered in a ring, and around that ring, more dead warriors than around any other position on the field. The Lakota would speak of these 2 for years, not with hatred, with respect. They had fought extraordinarily well. Their weapons had been superior, their courage had been real. It had not been enough. The infantry under Fetterman and Captain Brown had been driven uphill toward a cluster of rocks, the only defensible terrain in sight. Perhaps 30 men remained at this point. They formed a tight circle among the boulders, backs touching, facing outward into a ring of warriors that tightened with each minute. They fired. reloaded with fingers so numb from cold that the cartridges slipped and fell and had to be picked from the snow with hands that had stopped obeying. Fired again, each volley thinner than the last, each reload slower, each interval between shots filled with the hiss of arrows and the crack of stone points hitting the boulders inches from their faces, and the war cries of men who could smell the end coming. The rhythm was too slow, and the intervals between volleys were filled with sounds that no training had prepared them for. The hiss of arrows in flight, the crack of stone points hitting the rocks inches from their faces, the war cries of men who had been planning this moment for weeks and who were now close enough to see the expressions on the soldiers' faces change from determination to something worse. Some soldiers stopped trying to reload their Springfields entirely. The weapons that had won the Civil War were useless at this range and in these conditions. They swung the heavy rifles as clubs, 9 pounds of wood and iron wielded like medieval weapons against war clubs, and lances designed for exactly this kind of fighting. The air was thick with arrows. Later accounts described them rising and falling in waves, almost like rain, except that rain does not have stone points and rain does not make the sound that an arrow makes when it enters a human body. The circle shrank with each minute. Men fell against the rocks. The snow between the boulders darkened. The continuous roar of the first minutes, 1,000 voices and hundreds of weapons firing simultaneously, began to thin as fewer rifles answered. Fewer voices cried out. The rate of killing across the entire field was approximately 2 men per minute. Fetterman and Brown were found afterward lying side by side, each with a single wound to the head. Whether they killed each other or themselves in the final seconds, the meaning was identical. They chose their own ending over whatever they believed would follow. 40 minutes. That is how long it took to destroy an entire command. From the first arrow to the last breath, 81 men who walked out of a fort that morning simply ceased to exist. Back at the fort, Carrington heard the gunfire begin beyond the ridge, distant, muffled by frozen air. Then he heard it stop. The silence that followed was worse than any sound the frontier had ever produced. Captain Ten Eyck led a relief force to the ridge that afternoon. At the crest, his men stopped. They looked down into the valley. 81 bodies scattered across the frozen landscape, stripped of weapons and clothing. Every man who had crossed that ridge was accounted for. Ten Eyck's soldiers did not speak as they moved among the dead. There was nothing to say. It took multiple wagon trips to bring them all back. Inside the fort, Frances Grummond had spent the day in a private agony that no official report could capture. She was pregnant with a child who would never know its father. She had heard the gunfire begin that morning, distant and muffled beyond the ridge, a sound she had heard before on other mornings that ended with tired soldiers returning through the gate. Then she heard it stop, and the stopping was different from every other time the guns had fallen silent. This silence did not end with returning hoofbeats. It ended with wagons. She waited through hours of that silence, in a room that grew colder as the afternoon died. She knew before the wagons came through the gate. She knew the way a body knows weather is changing before the mind catches up. The wagons brought 81 bodies. Her husband's was among them. She would later write a memoir that became one of the most vivid accounts of frontier military life. A document written in grief, so precise it reads less like memory and more like testimony delivered under oath to an audience that includes the dead. The coalition's casualties told their own story. An estimated 10 to 15 killed, perhaps 50 wounded, heaviest around the position where Wheatley and Fisher made their stand with the Henry repeaters. A kill ratio of roughly 6 to 1 in favor of the Warriors. Not through superior weapons, through superior planning. The coalition withdrew with the same discipline it had shown in every phase of the operation. Over 1,000 warriors melting back into the landscape as if the frozen ground had swallowed them. They carried their dead and wounded with them. For the warriors, This was a victory of historic proportions. The prophecy of 100 in the hands had been fulfilled. The trap had functioned exactly as designed. Every element, the decoy operation, the hours of frozen silence, the simultaneous attack from every direction, had worked. Carrington needed to get word to the nearest telegraph station at Fort Laramie, 236 miles to the southeast. Through blizzard conditions in territory the coalition still controlled. A civilian scout named John Phillips, called Portuguese Phillips, volunteered. Nobody ordered him to go. No officer commanded the ride. Phillips looked at the situation, looked at the distance, looked at the weather, and decided that someone had to do it, and that someone might as well be him. He rode through the night on a horse borrowed from the fort's corral, through sub-zero wind that froze exposed skin in minutes and turned the moisture in his nostrils to ice with every breath. Through snow so deep his horse labored at every step, the animal's chest plowing through drifts that reached its belly. Through country where the warriors who had just killed 81 soldiers were still moving across the same landscape, returning to camps that Phillips could not see in the dark, but whose fires he could smell on the wind if the wind shifted. He rode for 4 days. He stopped only when the horse could no longer stand without rest. He ate snow because stopping to build a fire would have meant stopping to die. He arrived at Fort Laramie on Christmas night, staggering through the door of an officer's holiday ball where women in gowns and men in pressed uniforms were dancing to music that belonged to a world that had nothing to do with the one Phillips had just ridden through. He was frostbitten, barely conscious. His horse collapsed beneath him and would not rise. He delivered the worst news the frontier army had received in a generation, and then he collapsed too. The nation recoiled. Newspapers carried the story under headlines that screamed massacre. The public demanded answers. How had an entire command been wiped out to the last man by an enemy the government had assured them was primitive and disorganized? The questions echoed through Washington for months, and the answer, when it finally came, was something no American government had ever conceded on the frontier. Within 2 years, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed. The Bozeman Trail forts were abandoned. Every one. The Powder River country was recognized as unceded Lakota territory. The road was closed. Red Cloud's War stands as one of the only conflicts in American history where Native nations forced the United States to retreat from positions it occupied. The Lakota burned the empty forts to the ground. The smoke climbed into a winter sky that had watched 81 men die on the ridge beyond. It was a signal written in fire. This land is ours. The soldiers who came to take it are buried in it. 81. Men walked out of Fort Phil Kearny on a frozen December morning, led by a captain who believed 80 men could ride through the entire Sioux Nation. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho did not just prove him wrong. They made the United States abandon the road, abandon the forts, sign a treaty on native terms, and retreat. The age of American invincibility on the plains ended in 40 minutes on a ridge beyond a line that a colonel had drawn and a captain had crossed. It took the Army another decade and another 210 dead men on another ridge in Montana to realize it.